My manager aligned my performance review with my wedding. Priorities, she smirked. I chose to send my resignation to her boss during her evaluation. Timing taught us both plenty. I still remember the exact moment my hands started shaking. A single calendar notification flashed across my screen, threatening to steal my wedding day before it even began. The fluorescent lights of the office hummed, a dull drone I usually ignored, but today it felt like a spotlight on my sudden dread. I was at my desk, deep in quarterly reports, when that pop-up arrived and froze me cold. It said, Performance Review with Victoria Hayes. June 15th, 2 p.m. June 15th. My wedding day. For a solid 30 seconds, I honestly convinced myself it had to be a mistake. Victoria knew. Everyone in the office knew about my wedding. I'd submitted my time-off request 8 months ago, got written approval, even brought in save the dates for the whole department. That date had been circled on the communal calendar in bright pink marker since last September. My mind raced, desperate for any explanation. A calendar glitch, a temporary placeholder, some automated system that didn't cross-reference approved leave, anything other than what my gut was already screaming at me. I'd been at the firm for 5 years then. Started as a junior analyst right out of graduate school, clawed my way up with sheer determination and a willingness to tackle projects nobody else wanted. The first 2 years had been good. My original manager, a man named Robert who retired to Colorado, had mentored me carefully, pushed me toward leadership opportunities, and written glowing performance reviews that opened doors. When he left, I was genuinely optimistic about his replacement. Victoria Hayes arrived with impressive credentials and a reputation for transforming underperforming departments. The first 6 months were fine. Professional. She seemed competent, if a bit cold, more interested in metrics than relationships. I told myself that was just her management style, not every boss needed to be warm to be effective. The shift happened gradually. Small comments about my work that carried an edge I couldn't quite identify. Projects reassigned at the last minute without explanation. Meetings where my contributions were summarized by Victoria as if they'd been her ideas all along. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that I was imagining patterns that weren't there. Then came a client praise email 6 months ago, and suddenly, those patterns crystallized into something I couldn't ignore. I walked to Victoria's office with measured steps, clutching my phone like a lifeline. She was typing something, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose, and she didn't bother looking up when I knocked on her open door. Victoria, I think there might be an error with my performance review scheduling, I said, keeping my voice professional despite the anxiety clawing at my chest. It's showing June 15th, but that's my wedding day. I have approved paid time off. She finally glanced up, and the slight curve of her lips made my stomach drop. It wasn't a smile of embarrassment or apologetic recognition. It was something else entirely. No error, she said, returning her attention to her computer. That's when the review is scheduled. All reviews are happening that week, and that's your slot. But I won't be here. I'll be getting married. Ethan and I have been planning this for over a year. Victoria removed her glasses and fixed me with a look I'd seen her give underperforming interns. Eleanor, if you want to advance in this company, you need to demonstrate commitment. Anyone can have a wedding. Not everyone can prove they're serious about their career. I submitted the request 8 months ago. It was approved by HR. Approved PTO can be reconsidered based on business needs. She put her glasses back on, dismissing me. Priorities, Eleanor. You need to figure out what yours are. I stood frozen in her doorway, processing what had just happened. Victoria Hayes, my manager for the past 3 years, had just told me to choose between my wedding and my job. The same Victoria who had taken 2 weeks off for her daughter's destination wedding in Jamaica last summer. The same Victoria who left early every Thursday for hot yoga and called it a mental health necessity. There has to be another time slot, I managed. Any other day that week. I can come in the Monday before or the Friday after. The schedule is set. She didn't look up again. Close the door on your way out. My legs carried me out of her office on autopilot. The fluorescent lights in the hallway seemed too bright. The carpet pattern too geometric. Everything slightly off-kilter, like I'd stepped into a photograph that had been tilted 2 degrees. I passed the break room where someone was microwaving fish. Past the conference room where a client call was happening. Past the supply closet where I'd once hidden for 10 minutes after Victoria publicly criticized my presentation in front of the entire department. That memory surfaced unbidden. It had been a quarterly review meeting about 4 months ago, and I'd spent 3 weeks preparing a comprehensive analysis of our regional performance. The data was solid. The visualizations were clear. I'd rehearsed until I could deliver it in my sleep. Victoria had interrupted me 7 minutes in to point out a decimal error on slide 14, a typo that changed nothing about the underlying conclusions, but gave her an opening to question my attention to detail in front of David Miller and 2 visiting executives. I kept my composure during the meeting, smiled, acknowledged the error, continued with the presentation. But afterward, in the supply closet, I pressed my forehead against a shelf of printer paper and breathed through what felt like a panic attack. Chloe had found me there and said nothing, just handed me a tissue and stood guard outside the door until I was ready to face the world again. That was the day I'd started keeping records. Nothing formal at first, just a private document on my personal laptop where I noted dates and interactions that felt wrong. I told myself it was for my own sanity, a way to confirm that I wasn't imagining things. The document had grown to 47 entries over the past 4 months. Entry 48 would be about the wedding day performance review. I walked back to my desk in a daze. My coworker Chloe noticed immediately. She'd been with the company almost as long as I had, and we'd developed the kind of friendship that comes from surviving corporate absurdity together. What happened? You look like you just saw a ghost. I told her, and watched her expression shift from confusion to outrage to something harder to read. Eleanor, you know this isn't normal, right? This is Victoria being Victoria. Chloe lowered her voice. She's been gunning for you ever since you got that client praise that should have gone through her. She wasn't wrong. 6 months earlier, I had solved a major problem for our biggest account, and the client had sent a glowing email directly to our department director, David Miller, instead of routing the praise through Victoria first. David had mentioned it in a company-wide meeting, and I'd watched. Victoria's face tightened into something ugly before she rearranged it into a stiff smile. From that day forward, every interaction with her had carried an edge. The client issue had been genuinely complicated. A software migration had corrupted 3 months of transaction data, and their internal team was convinced the problem originated on our end. Victoria had assigned it to me with what I now recognized as a setup for failure. The deadline was impossible, the scope was unclear, and she'd offered 0 resources or guidance. I'd solved it anyway. Worked through 2 weekends, coordinated with their IT department, discovered the actual source of the corruption, and implemented a fix that recovered 97% of the lost data. The client CEO had been so impressed that he'd written directly to David, bypassing the usual channels entirely. He called me a problem solver of the highest caliber and suggested I be considered for client relationship management roles. David read excerpts from that email at the company meeting while I sat there, turning progressively redder. I glanced at Victoria during the applause and saw something in her expression that made my stomach clench. She was smiling, clapping along with everyone else, but her eyes had gone flat and calculating. The project reassignment started the following week. The subtle criticisms intensified. My access to high-visibility work dried up almost overnight. And now, 6 months later, she was demanding I attend a performance review on my wedding day. What am I supposed to do? I asked Chloe. Just not show up to my own wedding? Have you talked to HR? I hadn't. At that point, I still believed in the system. I believed that explaining the situation to reasonable people would result in a reasonable solution. That evening, I told my fiancé, Ethan, what had happened. We were sitting in our apartment, takeout containers spread across the coffee table, and I could see his jaw tighten as I recounted the conversation. "She can't actually force you to miss our wedding for a work meeting," he said. "That's insane. Technically, she's not forcing me. She's just making it clear that missing the review will impact my career. Eleanor, we've been together for 6 years. We've been planning this wedding for 14 months. Your mother has already flown in from Texas. My parents booked their flights in January. We have 120 guests coming. I know all of that. Then this shouldn't even be a question." He was right, of course, but Ethan worked in a field where he had autonomy and respect, where his boss would never dream of pulling something like this. He didn't understand the particular flavor of corporate hostage-taking that characterized my workplace. The next morning, I went to HR. I sat across from a woman named Sarah who listened to my situation with practiced neutrality, nodded at appropriate intervals, and then explained that while my paid time off was indeed approved, performance reviews were considered mandatory attendance events, and missing one could result in disciplinary action. But the review was scheduled after my PTO was approved, I pointed out. Deliberately scheduled on a day my manager knew I wouldn't be available. Sarah's expression didn't change. "I understand your frustration, but I don't have any evidence that the scheduling was deliberate. These reviews are assigned based on availability in the calendar system. My availability clearly shows I'm on PTO that day. I'll make a note of your concern." She closed her laptop in a way that signaled our conversation was ending. "My advice would be to speak with your manager about finding a resolution." I had already done that. Sarah knew I had already done that, but HR existed to protect the company, and Victoria had been there for 3 years with a spotless record on paper. I was just another employee with a complaint. Walking out of HR, I felt something shift inside me. The naive belief that fairness would prevail if I just followed the proper channels was crumbling. Sarah had barely typed anything during our conversation. She'd made no promises, offered no alternatives, shown no indication that my situation warranted any kind of investigation or intervention. I'd seen this dynamic play out before with other employees, watched people bring legitimate grievances to HR only to be redirected back to the very managers causing the problems. There was a woman named Jessica in accounting who had complained about her supervisor's inappropriate comments. HR had facilitated a mediation session, after which Jessica was transferred to a different department with fewer advancement opportunities. The supervisor kept his position and his corner office. The message was always the same: complain if you want, but understand that complaints have consequences, and those consequences rarely fall on the people in positions of power. Over the following weeks, I tried everything. I sent emails requesting alternate times, ceaselessly. I caught David Miller in the hallway and attempted to explain the situation, but he waved me off with a vague assurance that he trusted his managers to handle scheduling appropriately. I even approached Victoria one more time, practically begging for any other slot. And she told me that if I couldn't handle a simple scheduling conflict, perhaps I wasn't ready for the responsibilities that came with advancement. Meanwhile, wedding preparations continued. Ethan and I met with our caterer, finalized the seating chart, and did our final fitting at the tailor. Every toolbow and menu selection felt shadowed by the impossible choice looming over me. My mother called from Texas every few days, excited about the trip, asking questions about the venue and the flowers and whether Uncle Bill would behave himself at the reception. I couldn't tell her what was happening. She would have flown out immediately, marched into the firm, and caused a scene that would have made everything worse. So, I smiled through our phone calls and pretended that work was fine, that everything was proceeding according to plan. Ethan noticed. Of course, he noticed. We'd been together long enough that he could read my silences as easily as my words. He'd find me staring at my laptop at midnight, not typing, just scrolling through old emails. He'd wake up at 3 a.m. to an empty bed, and discover me on the couch, wedding planning spreadsheets open on my tablet, but completely untouched. One night, about 3 weeks before the wedding, he sat down beside me and took the tablet from my hands. "Talk to me," he said. "Really?" Talk to me. What's going through your head? I tried to explain. The feeling of being trapped between two impossible options. The knowledge that whatever I chose, something precious would be sacrificed. The way Victoria had somehow managed to insert herself into the most important day of my life, turning what should have been pure joy into a calculation of professional consequences. You know what keeps me up at night? I finally admitted. It's not just the wedding. It's that she's going to keep doing this. If I cave on this, if I show up to that review, she'll know exactly how to control me forever. Every future milestone, every important moment, she'll find a way to make me choose. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then don't let her. It's not that simple. Maybe it is. He pulled me closer. Maybe the only way to stop someone like her is to stop playing by rules that only apply to you. I didn't understand what he meant at the time, but his words planted something in the back of my mind, a seed of possibility that would eventually grow into a plan. 2 weeks before the wedding, I received another calendar notification. The performance review had been moved to 11 a.m. Still June 15th, still my wedding day. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 p.m., which meant that even if I attended the review, I'd be spending my wedding morning in a conference room being evaluated by someone who clearly wanted me to fail. I showed Ethan the notification that night, and something in his face changed. She moved it earlier, he said flatly. Not to a different day. Just earlier. So you'd have to be at the office until at least noon on your wedding day. I know. Eleanor. This woman is trying to ruin the most important day of our lives, and you're still trying to accommodate her. What choice do I have? If I skip the review, I could lose my job. Then maybe you need to lose that job. It was the first time either of us had said it out loud. I'd worked at the firm for 5 years. I'd built relationships, earned promotions, developed expertise that felt specific to that company. Starting over somewhere else felt terrifying. But Ethan was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Disappointment maybe, or exhaustion. I've been patient, he said, and his voice was steadier than I expected. I've listened to you talk about Victoria for 3 years. The snide comments, the stolen credit, the way she makes you feel like you're always one mistake away from disaster. And every time you've told me you can handle it, that it's not worth making waves. That things will get better if you just work harder and keep your head down. That's not fair, is it? He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. Eleanor, I love you. I want to spend my life with you, but I'm watching this job eat you alive, and now it's trying to eat our wedding, too. At some point, you have to decide if the fight is worth what you're losing. I'm not asking you to choose between me and your career, he said quietly. I'm asking you to choose between me and Victoria Hayes. Because if you go to that review instead of getting ready for our wedding, you're telling her that she wins. You're telling her she can treat you however she wants and you'll just take it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake replaying every interaction with Victoria over the past 3 years, every subtle put-down, every piece of credit she'd taken for my work, every time she'd smiled at me while sliding a knife between my ribs. I thought about the client praise email that had triggered her vendetta, about Sarah's carefully neutral expression, about David Miller walking away before I could finish my sentence. By morning, I had made a decision, but it wasn't the one Ethan expected. I wasn't going to quit. I wasn't going to skip the review. I wasn't going to beg Victoria for mercy one more time. I was going to burn the entire thing to the ground. The plan came together over the following 10 days. Chloe helped, though she didn't know the full extent of what I was preparing. She thought I was just gathering documentation to file a formal complaint after the wedding. In reality, I was building something much more comprehensive. The private document I'd been keeping for 4 months became my foundation. 48 entries of incidents, dates, witnesses, and my emotional responses at the time. Reading through them in sequence was painful. I could trace the gradual escalation, the way Victoria's behavior had intensified after any perceived slight or success on my part. The pattern was unmistakable once you saw it laid out chronologically. First, I collected every email Victoria had ever sent me, every passive-aggressive response, every unreasonable demand, every time she'd taken credit for my work in writing. I pulled the original client praise email and Victoria's subsequent messages criticizing my grandstanding. I documented the project assignments she'd given me versus the ones she'd kept for herself, the pattern of high-visibility work flowing to her favorites while I got buried in administrative tasks. There was an email from October where she'd carbon copied the entire department on a criticism of my expense report formatting. The formatting had been correct according to company policy. She'd simply invented a new requirement and used my supposed failure to establish that I was careless with details. Another email from December congratulated the team on landing a new client, a client I had personally courted for 6 months, while Victoria contributed nothing but her signature on the final contract. Second, I reached out to former employees. 3 people had left the department in the past 2 years, and I found 2 of them on LinkedIn. Both were willing to talk. Both had stories that echoed mine. One woman, Laura, told me that Victoria had scheduled her performance review during her chemotherapy appointment and suggested that if she was healthy enough to work, she was healthy enough to attend a meeting. Laura's story haunted me. She'd been diagnosed with breast cancer 2 years ago during what should have been the prime of her career. She tried to keep working through treatment, maintaining her responsibilities while managing side effects that left her exhausted and nauseated. Victoria had responded to her diagnosis by increasing her workload, questioning her commitment, and ultimately creating conditions so hostile that Laura had resigned rather than continue fighting on 2 fronts. This had happened before the client praise incident that triggered Victoria's vendetta against me, proving that her cruelty wasn't personal. It was simply who she was. I should have reported her, Laura told me over the phone, her voice heavy with regret. I had documentation. I had witnesses, but I was so tired. Eleanor, fighting cancer took everything I had. I couldn't fight Victoria, too. The other former employee, a man named Daniel, had left for a competitor after Victoria passed him over for a promotion he'd been promised. He told me about the way she dangled advancement in front of him for 2 years, always finding reasons to delay, always moving the goalpost just when he thought he'd met her requirements. When he finally confronted her about the pattern, she told him that his aggressive attitude was exactly why he wasn't ready for leadership. She called me aggressive, Daniel said with a bitter laugh. I'm literally the least confrontational person you'll ever meet. But that's her trick, right? She invents narratives and then acts like they're established facts. I recorded our conversations with their permission. I transcribed the relevant portions and added them to my documentation folder. Third, I discovered something that changed everything. While digging through old project files for documentation, I found discrepancies in the expense reports Victoria had submitted for a client dinner last October. The dinner had been for 3 people. The receipt showed charges for 7, nearly $400 in overcharges buried in a quarterly expense report that had been rubber-stamped without review. I wasn't looking for financial fraud. I was looking for evidence of hostile management. But sometimes the universe hands you exactly what you need. The discovery happened almost by accident. I was searching through old project files for an email thread where Victoria had criticized my work, trying to find the specific language she'd used. The search function pulled up a folder I hadn't accessed in months containing expense reports from a client development initiative last fall. I'd been on that initiative. The dinner in question had been a legitimate business expense, a meeting with potential clients at an upscale restaurant downtown. I remembered the event clearly because Victoria had insisted on attending at the last minute, turning what should have been a relaxed relationship-building meal into a tense performance review conducted over appetizers. There had been 3 people at that dinner, me, Victoria, and the prospective client. That was it. The expense report showed charges for 7 people. Wine bottles I didn't remember ordering. Desserts that nobody had eaten. An amount that nearly doubled the actual cost of the meal. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake. Some administrative error, a wrong receipt attached to the wrong report. But the itemized charges told a different story. Specific dishes, specific wines, specific quantities that could only have been intentionally fabricated. I dug deeper, found the original receipt attached to a different file, the actual receipt from the restaurant showing the real total. Someone had created a modified version, added fictional charges, and submitted it as a legitimate expense. The signatures matched Victoria's handwriting. For nearly an hour, I sat at my desk staring at my screen, trying to process what I'd found. This wasn't just documentation of bad management. This was evidence of fraud, potentially criminal fraud, depending on how much money was involved across how many expense reports. I photographed everything. I organized it into a folder with clear labels and dates. I wrote a timeline that showed the pattern of retaliation following the client praise incident. I included the names and contact information of the former employees willing to corroborate, noting that their experiences predated mine and established a longer pattern of misconduct. The folder grew larger than I expected. When I finally assembled all the pieces, I had over 70 pages of documentation, emails, screenshots, timeline entries, transcripts, and the explosive evidence of financial misconduct. Looking at it spread across my laptop screen felt surreal, like I was seeing my professional life through a forensic lens for the first time. Chloe noticed that something had changed. We were having lunch in the break room 3 days before my wedding when she asked me directly. "You seem different," she said, studying my face. "Calmer than you've been in weeks." What happened? I couldn't tell her about the expense report fraud. That was too dangerous to share before I'd made my move, but I could share a version of the truth. "I made a decision," I said. "About the performance review situation." "You're going to skip it?" "Something like that." Chloe leaned forward. "Eleanor, whatever you're planning, be careful. Victoria has allies. David trusts her. If you come at her and miss, she'll make your life hell." "I know." I took a bite of my sandwich, surprised by how steady my hands were. "That's why I'm not going to miss." June 14th arrived. My rehearsal dinner was that evening, and my family was already in town. My mother kept asking if I was nervous, and I kept saying yes because I was, just not about the wedding. At 9 p.m., I sent an email. It went to David Miller, Sarah in HR, and Harrison Webb, the Chief Operating Officer. The subject line was, "Formal complaint regarding Victoria Hayes. Documentation attached." The email detailed 6 months of retaliatory behavior directed at me, combined with corroborating accounts from former employees that established a years-long pattern of misconduct. It included the expense report discrepancies, clearly labeled and sourced. It noted that I would not be attending the scheduled review and that any disciplinary action taken against me would be met with legal consultation. Then I turned off my phone and went to my rehearsal dinner. The dinner was at a small Italian restaurant Ethan and I loved. The kind of place with checkered tablecloths and candles and wine bottles, and an owner who remembered your name. Both families were there, awkwardly mingling across generations and geographic divides. My mother kept touching my arm like she couldn't believe the wedding was really happening. Ethan's father gave an impromptu toast that made everyone laugh. For a few hours, I forgot about the firm entirely. I let myself exist in the simple joy of being surrounded by people who loved me, who had traveled hundreds of miles to celebrate a promise Ethan and I were about to make. My sister cornered me near the dessert table and demanded to know if I was nervous, and I realized with some surprise that I wasn't. The wedding itself felt like the easy part now. The hard part was already done. The email was sent. Whatever happened next would unfold without any further action required from me. That night, lying in the hotel room I booked so Ethan wouldn't see me before the ceremony, I thought about Victoria opening her email Monday morning. I imagined her clicking on my name, expecting some last-minute plea for schedule accommodation, and finding instead a comprehensive indictment of her management practices. I imagined her scrolling through the expense report documentation, realizing that her carefully constructed professional image was about to collapse. Part of me felt guilty, a small, fading part that had been trained to avoid conflict, to prioritize other people's comfort, to believe that fighting back was somehow inappropriate. But that part of me was getting quieter by the hour. June 15th was beautiful. Clear skies, warm without being oppressive, the kind of day that makes you believe the universe is paying attention. I got ready at the venue with my bridesmaids, deliberately not thinking about what was happening at the firm. My mother helped with my veil. My sister fixed my makeup when I started crying during my vows. Ethan and I exchanged rings in front of everyone we loved. We danced our first dance to a song we'd chosen during a road trip 3 years earlier. My father made a toast that was somehow both embarrassing and perfect. By the time the reception wound down, I had almost forgotten about Victoria Hayes entirely. The reminder came the following Monday. I had taken the week after my wedding off as well, so I wasn't checking work email, but Chloe texted me with a single line, "You need to call me immediately." When I reached her, she was barely coherent with excitement. "Victoria is gone," she said. "They walked her out this morning. Security escorted her to her car." "What?" "Your email, Eleanor. Your email went to Harrison Webb. He read it over the weekend. He apparently called an emergency meeting with David and Sarah first thing this morning. They pulled the expense reports going back 3 years and found more discrepancies. They're talking about an audit." I sat down on the edge of the hotel bed where Ethan and I were spending our honeymoon week. My new husband was looking at me with raised eyebrows. "There's more," Chloe continued. "You know how Victoria was supposed to have her own performance review with David today? It was scheduled for 2 p.m. Instead, at 2 p.m. she was in HR being told to pack her desk. The timing hadn't been intentional. I'd sent my email the night before my wedding because that was when I had all my documentation ready. But the fact that Victoria's termination happened during what should have been her own review felt like poetry I couldn't have written better myself. I returned to work the following week to a different landscape. David Miller called me into his office on my first day back and apologized. He said he hadn't been aware of the extent of the situation, that he should have listened when I tried to speak with him, and that he was committed to creating a healthier department culture. Sarah sent an email expressing regret that my concerns hadn't been addressed sooner. The expense report investigation expanded. They found nearly $12,000 in fraudulent charges over a 4-year period. Victoria wasn't just fired. She was facing potential legal action. 3 months later, I was promoted to Victoria's former position. The announcement came during a department meeting, and I watched the faces of my colleagues as David read the press release. Some of them looked surprised. Some of them smiled knowingly. Chloe gave me a small nod that contained everything she couldn't say in that moment. The job came with a significant raise and an office with a window. On my first day in that office, I moved the desk so I could see the door. No one would ever be dismissed the way Victoria had dismissed me. No one would ever have to stand in a doorway waiting for acknowledgement that wouldn't come. Last month, I received a LinkedIn request from a woman I didn't recognize. Her profile showed she worked at a mid-sized consulting firm downtown. Her message was brief: "I heard what happened. I used to work for Victoria at her previous company. If you ever need confirmation that you did the right thing, I have stories." I accepted the request. I read her stories. They were worse than mine. Ethan and I recently celebrated our first anniversary. We went back to the venue where we got married and had dinner at the same restaurant where we'd held our rehearsal. Over dessert, he asked if I ever regretted how things played out. The timing was petty, I admitted. Sending the email the night before my wedding so her consequences would land during her performance review? That was deliberate. Do you feel bad about it? I considered the question seriously. I thought about Laura and her chemotherapy appointments. I thought about the woman on LinkedIn and her stories. I thought about every person Victoria had stepped on during her climb, every career she damaged, every moment of cruelty she disguised as professionalism. No, I said finally. She taught me about priorities. I just happened to be a faster learner than she expected. Ethan raised his glass. To excellent timing. I clinked my glass against his. To excellent timing. The office with a window is still mine. The department culture has genuinely improved. Chloe got promoted last quarter, and we still have lunch together every Wednesday. David Miller treats me as a peer now rather than an obstacle. And Sarah and I have developed something approaching mutual respect. I keep the email I sent on June 14th saved in a personal folder. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Sometimes the system does work. Sometimes documentation matters. Sometimes the person who tries to make you choose between your life and your job ends up losing both of theirs. Victoria Hayes taught me that priorities matter. She just never imagined I'd prioritize myself. I found out recently that Victoria landed at another company, a smaller firm, lower title, significant pay cut. I heard through the professional grapevine that she's already developing a reputation there, that the same patterns are emerging, that at least 2 junior employees have already started looking for exits. Part of me wanted to reach out to them, to warn them about what they were dealing with, to offer the kind of documentation strategy that had worked for me. But I've learned that some lessons have to be lived before they can be applied. Those employees will figure it out eventually, or they won't. My story is already written. What I've come to understand is that people like Victoria don't just happen. They're created by systems that reward their behavior, by supervisors who look the other way, by HR departments that prioritize ease over justice. David Miller had 12 years to notice what Victoria was doing. Sarah had access to every complaint that was ever filed. The expense report fraud had been sitting in plain sight, waiting for someone to care enough to look. I was just angry enough to look. The woman from LinkedIn, the one who worked for Victoria at her previous company, she told me that she tried to file complaints years ago. Nothing happened. No investigation, no consequences, no acknowledgement. The difference between her experience and mine wasn't courage or strategy. It was luck. I happened to send my email to someone who happened to take it seriously at a moment when they happened to be paying attention. That's the part they don't tell you. The satisfaction isn't guaranteed. The victory isn't inevitable. Sometimes you do everything right and nothing changes. And you have to live with the knowledge that you tried while watching the person who harmed you continue to thrive. I got lucky. I got married. I got the job. I got to watch Victoria Hayes walk out of the building with a cardboard box in her arms on the same day she thought she'd be cementing her authority over my career. But every time I sit in my office and look out that window, I think about all the people who didn't get lucky. The ones who are still dealing with their own Victoria, still trying to decide whether to stay or go, still wondering if the system will ever work in their favor. To those people, I can only offer this: document everything. Build your case slowly and carefully. Find allies where you can. And when the moment comes, when you finally have leverage, don't hesitate. Don't second guess. Don't let them convince you that your priorities are wrong. Some battles are worth fighting even when you might lose, but it certainly helps when you win. My wedding photos hang on the wall of my new office. Ethan picked out the frames. In my favorite picture, we're both laughing at something my father said, completely unaware of the camera, completely present in a moment that belonged only to us. Victoria tried to take that day from me. Instead, she gave me something more valuable than any performance review could have provided. She gave me the certainty that I would never let anyone make me choose between my life and my dignity again. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd handled things differently. If I'd simply skipped the review without sending the email, accepted whatever disciplinary action followed, and moved on with my life, would Victoria still be at the firm, making someone else miserable? Would the expense report fraud have eventually been discovered through some other channel? I'll never know the answers. What I do know is that taking action, making a choice instead of passively accepting the situation imposed on me, changed something fundamental about how I see myself. For years, I'd been the person who kept her head down, who followed the rules, who believed that hard work would eventually be recognized and rewarded. Victoria taught me that sometimes the rules are designed to protect the people breaking them. The expense report investigation revealed more than anyone expected. $12,000 in fraudulent charges over 4 years, spanning dozens of client dinners and department events. Victoria had been systematically padding her expenses, trusting that the approval process was too routine for anyone to scrutinize the details. She was right, until she made an enemy willing to look. I've heard through professional channels that she's tried to spin the story. Claimed she was wrongfully terminated, that the expense report issues were accounting errors, that I orchestrated a vindictive campaign against her because I couldn't handle constructive criticism. Some people probably believe her. There are always people willing to believe that women who speak up are really the problem. But the people who matter know the truth. Laura knows, Daniel knows, the woman from LinkedIn knows, and I know, and I think that is the real victory. Not the promotion or the office or even watching her face consequences for years of cruelty. The real victory is knowing exactly who I am and what I'm willing to accept. Victoria Hayes was right about one thing. Priorities matter. I figured out mine. What would you have done?